The Gamesman was written by Barry Malzberg in 1983. At only 188 pages, it's short, but it's focused. It's got no bloat, and every single page goes to further the metaphor that's at the crux of the story. People in Malzberg's depiction of this bleak future Earth are miserable, and there doesn't seem to be any of your classic time killers like games and sports, cooking and reading. Depressed and with no other options and no other ways to turn to, the world is dominated by what is called the game. The game is this ill-defined, life-controlling activity where players seem to be given these individualized tasks for them to compete. And if you lose, there seem to be dangerous or even deadly outcomes. I say seem to because the rules are never fully realized. Readers are just sort of piecemeal fed rules when caveats become important. At the start of the book, we're only given 2 specific examples as to what a round of the game even looks like. The first one is this sort of history trivia game, and the second one is, you guessed it, ejaculating into a woman's vagina. The latter task was assigned to our main character, Papa Joe Block, at the start of the book. He's a 27-year-old living high up in this massive apartment complex in the bleak future Earth. He lives in a city kind of akin to like Star Wars' Coruscant, if you're familiar with that. It seems like this overpopulated, over-technologized hellscape. He lives in his own tiny little cubicle apartment just a few yards by a few yards, and that's all he has. Although as someone paying downtown rent right now, that does feel a bit utopian, but I digress. In the future, technology is to this point where, quote, you can live a life insulated from strong emotions of any sort. Because of this, people are pretty depressed. Half of the population kills themselves before they reach 25, known as the age of choice. And if you do that before you're 25, it's seen as like natural or normal, but after 25, it's seen as a high crime. And that's like 90% of the world building we get in this book. I can probably count the concrete world building elements we're given on one hand. Even in terms of characters, we're maybe introduced to like 8 in the entire book, 5 of which are even given any sort of title, and only 1 of which has an actual name, our main character. Block is a prototypical guy in society. He's obsessed with the game, and it's really all that he has in his life. It's his only interest and his only meaning on Earth. One day, though, his games master, which is pretty much like the referee to him playing the game, tells him that it's all a trick and the game is not what he thinks it is. They're all set up to fail, and that it's actually impossible for anyone to win the game. The rest of the book is essentially Malzberg strengthening and utilizing his metaphor of how the game is essentially how our modern society functions. There's clear ties to the games being capitalism or like the American dream, and I certainly see aspects of the game just being things like groupthink and fitting into social norms and other thoughts as well. It's a flexible metaphor. This book essentially is like Malzberg just taking the metaphor as a big piece of meat and just taking a huge bite and just masticating on it for the entirety of the book, just chewing on every little nook and cranny of the metaphor. As I said earlier, the world building and characters in this book are sparse, but everything has its meaning. I do a lot of crossword puzzles, and it sort of reminds me of like the book being kind of like crossword clues. They're just so short that every single little thing matters. If there's a question mark, if it's italicized, if there's a capitalization, everything means something. I want to go over some of the ways that Malzberg uses the game as a metaphor for humanity. The brilliance in this book is really in his accuracy of the world as this metaphor. And I think the best way that I can depict it is by giving you some spoiler-free examples of the metaphor in action. First, it's used to show how the system is unfairly run by elites who prey upon the rat race of the game contestants for their own prosperity. The gamesman that spills the beans to Block earlier on in the book tells him that, quote, The few at the very top of this miserable society who control everything know that if people truly understood their position, the unfairness of it, they would be toppled by a revolution within minutes, because they're so outnumbered. But they use the idea of the game so that they can fixate on that, so that people can have the illusion that they can use the game to improve their position. But it's all a lie. Initially in denial, Block says that he recognizes this, but he thinks that 99% of society can't beat the game, but he'll be the 1% that does. He says, quote, "We hold on to the belief that there is some possibility and that we might be the ones to beat it. It's essentially like winning the lottery." Malzberg also touches on the hopelessness of people thinking that the only successful way or semi-successful way that a society can function is by participating in something like this game. Multiple people in the book, when confronted with the reality of the game, basically just say like, "I don't care. I'm just here to mind my own business and keep my head down and stay quiet." One character even says, quote, "If the game is a lie, then why should I lose?" Another character even makes a startlingly good argument that it's unfair to simply tell the people the truth of the game without giving them any better offering. Even if you're just perpetuating a lie, how is that worse than living in hopelessness? Next, the book depicts the difficulty of saving yourself from a system of lies. When Block's Gamesman dumps what is essentially the info hazard of the game being rigged on him, it really greatly disturbs Block. He doesn't know if he can take the truth. Quote, "If he understands the assumptions of the game wholly, then he is denying his life. What is a man without his life? He is not simply constituted to make that kind of leap." Additionally, Block notices how nobody really wins in an unethical system. Block incorrectly assumes that at worst, the game is a zero-sum game, and he's going to possibly win it. But in reality, everyone, in one way or another, does lose. Quote, "He had always envisioned his problems with the game as one of mastering its circumstances and prevailing to its end. But what he did not expect was that the winning would only open a new and awful set of problems." Lastly, the novel is not without its hope, though. Block grapples with what it means to fight back against a system that he sees as corrupt. He holds power when he realizes that there's actually power within himself and the people that are within the game. The game is not controlled by some omnipresence, it's controlled by the people within it. Block shows some somber hope that regarding destroying a corrupt system, quote, "It will look for a while as if everything will collapse because the game is so important, but it won't." Block's internal and sometimes actual confrontation with the system is what makes up the main conflict in this book. All right, let's move a little bit beyond this metaphor and let's talk a bit about how the Gamesman is written. The only other Malzberg book that I've read is Beyond Apollo, and this matches a lot with the oddness of it in terms of its writing. It switches from like first and third person, and some chapters play with how books are supposed to be written. Like one chapter is just a chart, like a table. I don't know if I exactly like this, but it's certainly unique. Also, like Beyond Apollo, this is an extremely graphic book, but I totally love it. The graphic depictions of sex are a big part of the plot, but I always feel like Malzberg, when he does these graphic depictions of sex and violence stuff, it's done in a very artfully, in-your-face type of way. Malzberg's characters, at least in the books of his that I've read, are extremely horny, but not in like the way that other new age science fiction books are. Sex is omnipresent and his characters are lecherous, but it's like in an honest and usually a self-demeaning way. It's not in like an exploitative, low-key misogynistic way that I feel like the majority of books from this era are written. Although I will say that I'm a man, and that's all just my opinion, and I'd love to hear feedback, but that's generally how I perceive it. I've got a few other things that I want to touch on. I've mentioned that we don't get to learn a ton about the world, but one thing that I have not mentioned that we do learn about is seemingly the only other alternative to the game in this society, and that's these things called transporters, which are basically like for menial amounts of money, they will teleport you to different places around the world. This is clearly meant to be a metaphor, But I think it's also kind of funny to think about the straightforwardness of this analogy. As someone with a lot of friends in their late 20s that work in tech, I know a lot of people with some disposable income, and I have seen a lot of very unhappy people take extremely lavish, uncomfortable vacations in the hopes of finding something out about themselves. Maybe I'm just like a salty, broke bitch, but I do kind of like the validity of this as a direct comparison to our real world rather than it being an analogy. Obviously, this is not what it was intended to be perceived as, but I don't know. Anyway, next, I just want to say that I loved the ending. It's very short story-esque, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It works really well for a short book like this. There's this little plot twist and punchline, and you can almost hear the deep bass bellowing as the credits are going to roll. Okay, let's move on to a few criticisms that I have of the book. There are some things that I personally appreciated, but I wouldn't be surprised if they grinded some people's gears. People are going to have their own thoughts on things like Malzberg's writing style and his extremely sparse world building in this book, to name just a few. Also, for you to like this book, the theme has got to land and mean a lot for you, since commentary about that metaphor is pretty much the vast majority of this book. But from a literary standpoint, there are only really like two things that bothered me a fair amount when it came to this book. First, the whole shtick of this book is kind of defined and outlined within the first like 3 chapters of the book. So someone who dislikes this book could argue that from this point on, the message is just kind of regurgitated out over and over. But I don't know, I think that the way that it's rehashed and commented on is generally quite clever. And I mean, Jesus, the book is like less than 200 pages, so it's not too bad anyway. Playing off my own metaphor of Malzberg taking a big bite out of some meat and just chewing on it the whole book, I think that your enjoyment of the book would depend on how much you enjoy the flavor of that bite. The other potential issue that I have with the book is Block sort of buys into the idea that his entire life is a lie in like a really short amount of time, like literally one conversation. It seems a little bit unrealistic, but I do understand that that type of expediency is necessary, or at least somewhat necessary, in a short book like this. While I did end on a couple of negatives, I do really think that this book is worth the read. The Gamesman is short and it's pointed while still being quite memorable. There's no bullshit, and the coarseness of Malzberg's writing style lends itself really well to the presentation of this metaphor. I wouldn't overthink it. If you are looking for a quick read and you like the idea of this metaphor, then go for it. Also, Barry Malzberg just passed away a couple of months ago, so if you're looking for a book to remember him or honor his legacy, I think that this is a great choice. So rest in peace to a great writer, and thank you, Malzberg, for your incredibly concise yet memorable book, The Gamesman. Thanks for watching.